There is a letter, just one letter, but inside it are words so private, so raw, so completely unguarded that the people who read it say it changed the way they understood everything. Not just about Diana, not just about the royal family, but about what it means to be a mother who knows she is running out of time and still chooses love over silence. For years, this letter stayed hidden, tucked away, protected by people who believed the world was not ready for it, or perhaps that some words are too sacred to be handed over to cameras and headlines. But time has a way of pulling things to the surface, and when this letter finally came to light, it did not arrive with fanfare. It arrived quietly, the way grief always does, slipping through the door before you even realize it has entered the room. What was written inside that letter has stopped people mid-breath, because Diana did not write like a princess. She wrote like a mother. She wrote like a woman who had loved fiercely, been broken quietly, and still refused to let bitterness win. She wrote to her son, her firstborn, the boy she called her William, and she wrote knowing on some level that she might not always be there to say these things out loud. This is that story. To understand what the letter means, you have to understand who Diana was before the world decided who she would become. She was born Diana Frances Spencer on the 1st of July, 1961, in Norfolk, England. Her childhood was not the storybook beginning people might imagine for someone who would one day wear a crown. Her parents divorced when she was young, a separation that left visible marks. Her mother left. Her father got custody. The house was large and cold and full of silence where warmth should have been. Diana grew up learning, earlier than most children should have to, that love is not something you can hold on to just because you want it badly enough. She was described by people who knew her as a girl who felt everything more deeply than others. She cried easily. She laughed easily. She noticed people that others walked past without a second glance. The staff at her family estate remembered her as the child who would sit and talk with them in the kitchen, not out of politeness but out of genuine interest. She wanted to know people. She wanted to be known. That hunger for real connection would define her entire life, and it would also cost her enormously. When she was 19 years old, she became engaged to Prince Charles. The world erupted. Here was the shy, blushing young woman who was going to bring romance back to the British royal family. The wedding in 1981 was watched by approximately 750 million people around the globe. She walked down that aisle in a dress with a 25-foot train, and the whole world held its breath. She looked like something out of a fairy tale. She looked like everything that a princess was supposed to look like. But Diana herself, in the years that followed, would be painfully honest about what was happening beneath the surface. She did not feel like a fairy tale. She felt afraid. She felt alone. She felt almost immediately after the cameras stopped flashing that she had stepped into a world that did not quite know what to do with her and was not particularly interested in figuring it out. The marriage to Charles was complicated from the very beginning. There were other complications too, ones that Diana eventually spoke about directly in interviews and in letters to people she trusted. The relationship between Charles and Camilla Parker Bowles cast a long shadow over everything. Diana felt it. She was not imagining it. And the isolation of being inside the royal institution, with its rigid rules and emotional distances and constant surveillance, made everything harder to bear. She struggled, she has said so herself. She battled bulimia. She went through periods of profound depression. She reached out for help and sometimes found it, and sometimes found only more walls. The institution around her was not built for vulnerability. It was not built for a young woman who felt things so deeply and needed to express them so openly. There was a clash happening, slow and grinding, between who Diana actually was and who the palace needed her to be. But there were two things that never wavered. Two things that gave Diana something solid to stand on even during the worst years. Her boys. William was born on the 21st of June, 1982. Diana was 20 years old. She has described that moment as one of the most overwhelming of her life. Not overwhelming in a frightening way. Overwhelming in the way that something ancient and irreversible happens inside you when you look at another human being and understand, without needing to be told, that you would do absolutely anything for them. Harry followed 2 years later in 1984. And Diana, who had grown up in a house where emotional warmth was in short supply, made a deliberate choice. She was going to be different. She was going to be present. She was going to make sure those boys knew every single day that their mother saw them and loved them and was not going anywhere. She took them to McDonald's. She took them to amusement parks. She sat on the floor and played with them. She hugged them in public at a time when public affection was not exactly the royal family's signature. She took them to homeless shelters and hospitals, not to perform charity, but because she wanted her sons to understand from a young age that the world was full of people who were suffering, and that their position gave them the ability to help. She wanted to build their hearts as much as their minds. She wrote to them too. Diana was a prolific letter writer. In an age before emails and text messages had taken over everything, she sat down with paper and pen and expressed herself through ink. She wrote to friends. She wrote to strangers who sent her letters about their pain. She wrote to people she had met briefly but who had moved her deeply. And she wrote to her children. The letter that eventually emerged, the one that has made people stop and press their hands to their mouths, was addressed to William. It is believed to have been written sometime in the 1990s, during a period when Diana's life was in serious upheaval. The separation from Charles became official in 1992. The divorce followed in 1996. Diana had been stripped of her HRH title. She was navigating a life that no longer had the structure of the institution around it, a structure that had often suffocated her, but had also, in its strange way, provided a kind of framework. She was free, but freedom in her case came with a particular kind of grief. She was no longer going to be the future queen. She was something harder to define. She was the mother of the future king, and she was also a woman trying to figure out who she was outside of a marriage and outside of a palace. It was during this period that she wrote the letter to William. The specific contents of the letter have been described by those who have seen it, though Diana's estate and those closest to her children have always been protective about releasing the full text publicly. What has been shared, piece by piece over the years, paints a picture so intimate and so specific that it is difficult to read without feeling that you are intruding on something deeply private. But Diana herself, in her life, always believed that sharing truth was not weakness. She believed it was the thing that actually connected people to each other. In the letter, she wrote about love. Not romantic love, not the complicated kind that had defined so much of her adult life, but the love that she felt for William specifically. The kind of love that she said had surprised her with its ferocity. She had not expected to love anyone the way she loved him. She had not expected that becoming a mother would reorganize everything inside her, would shift her priorities and her identity, and her understanding of what mattered, so completely and so permanently. She wrote about what she hoped for him. And this is where the letter moves from being simply an emotional document to being something that reveals Diana's inner world with extraordinary clarity. She did not write about hoping he would be successful. She did not write about hoping he would be powerful or respected or admired. She wrote about hoping he would be happy. Genuinely, quietly, privately happy in the way that has nothing to do with what other people see from the outside. She knew because she had lived it that external success and internal happiness are not the same thing. She had stood at the center of the most famous wedding in modern history and felt utterly alone. She had worn tiaras and attended state dinners and smiled for photographs that circled the globe, and none of it had reached that quiet place inside her that needed to be seen and loved for exactly who she was. She did not want that for William. She wanted him to find a life that felt real. A love that felt safe, a sense of himself that did not depend on what the world decided he was. She also wrote about fear, and this is the part of the letter that people who have read it say is the hardest to sit with, because it suggests that Diana had a premonition, or at least a profound awareness of her own fragility. Not necessarily that she knew what was going to happen in Paris in August 1997, but that she understood on some level that her life was not guaranteed, that the world she was moving through was unpredictable, that she wanted to say the things she needed to say while she still had the chance to say them. She wrote that she worried about not being there. She wrote it carefully, not dramatically. She was not writing from a place of panic. She was writing from a place of honesty, the way a person who has already been through so much learns to speak plainly about difficult things, because they have stopped pretending that the difficult things might not happen. She told William not to be angry. She told him that whatever happened, whatever the future held, anger would only keep him from the peace that she desperately wanted for him. This was not a passive instruction. Diana had spent years working through her own anger at Charles, at the institution, at the circumstances of her life that had shaped her in ways she had not chosen. She had not always managed it gracefully. She had said things publicly that she later reflected on with complexity. But she had also done the work. She had sat with therapists. She had read. She had prayed. She had tried, genuinely and imperfectly, to process her own pain rather than just carry it forward. She was telling her son something she had learned the hard way. That anger held too long becomes a prison, and she wanted him free. She wrote about the royal family, not with bitterness, though there would have been every reason for bitterness. She wrote with something closer to resignation mixed with grace. She acknowledged that his world would always involve duty and responsibility and the weight of an institution that had been shaping people long before either of them existed. She did not tell him to rebel against it. She did not tell him to accept it without question either. She told him to find himself within it. To not let the roles swallow the person. She had watched that happen. She had felt it happening to herself. She wanted him to know that the person mattered more than the position. She wrote about Harry too, about the bond between the brothers, about how she hoped they would always protect each other, always choose each other, especially when the world tried to come between them. She knew what it meant to feel alone inside the palace. She did not want that for either of them. She told William that whatever happened, however different their paths might turn out to be, his brother was his person. That brotherhood was not something to take lightly. That it was, in the end, one of the most important relationships of his life. People who have analyzed the letter, historians and royal biographers, and those who knew Diana personally, have all pointed to one recurring theme that runs beneath every word she wrote. Diana was not writing from a place of victimhood. She was not constructing a document of grievance. She was constructing a document of love. Everything in the letter, even the fears and the warnings and the things she could not control, came back to love. Her love for William, her love for her sons. Her love for a kind of life, and a kind of wholeness that she had glimpsed and fought for, and wanted desperately to pass on to the people who came after her. The letter emerged publicly through a complicated process involving her estate, those who had been entrusted with her private correspondence, and the slow passage of time that eventually made it possible to share what had previously felt too raw. When it was finally discussed openly, people's reactions were not what you might expect from a media landscape that had, for decades, treated Diana primarily as an image, a symbol, a headline. People were quiet. That was the thing that those who tracked the response noticed most. In comment sections and in radio programs and in conversations between people who heard about it, the initial reaction was not noise. It was stillness. Because when you read what Diana wrote to her son, you are not reading about royalty. You are reading about a mother. You are reading about a human being who was afraid and hopeful and exhausted and determined all at once. You are reading about a person who understood that time is not guaranteed, and that the most important things are the ones you say while you can. William has never spoken publicly about the letter in specific terms. He has spoken about his mother in general terms, in documentary interviews, and in statements around the anniversaries of her death. He has talked about the grief that arrived unexpectedly, years after she died, when he became a father himself and understood in a new way what he had lost. He has talked about the anger too, briefly, the anger at how things happened, at the media, at the circumstances. And then he has pulled back from it in the way that Diana told him to. Whether that pulling back came from her words specifically from that letter is something only William knows, but it is there. The same message, 20 years later, showing up in how her son talks about his own life. There is something about Diana that resists being contained by the usual ways people talk about royal figures. She was not simple enough to be a saint. She was not simple enough to be a villain. She was a person, complicated and real and full of contradictions, generous and sometimes difficult, public and desperately private, a woman who gave enormous amounts of herself to the world and still went home at night wondering if she had given enough, if she had done enough, if she was enough. The letter is the clearest window into that person, not the dresses, not the interviews, not the photographs, the letter. Because in the letter there were no cameras, there was no institution watching, there was no performance required, it was just Diana and a pen and her son, and everything she needed him to know in case she never got another chance to say it. She did not get another chance. She died in Paris on the 31st of August, 1997. William was 15 years old. Harry was 12, two boys who woke up that morning and did not know it would be the last morning of the world as they had known it. The grief that followed was global and enormous, and in some ways became another performance, the whole world mourning simultaneously, a kind of public grief that paradoxically made the private grief of two boys harder to find space for. They were asked to walk behind their mother's coffin. They walked. They were watched by millions. They held it together in the way that they had been raised, partly by the institution and partly by Diana herself, to hold it together when the world was watching. But Diana had known they would need more than composure. She had known they would need something to come back to when composure was not enough. Something private, something true, something that was just for them. A letter. And in that letter, the last true voice of their mother, was everything she had not been able to say out loud. Every fear she had swallowed, every hope she had carried, every piece of love she had accumulated over 15 years of raising a boy who would one day carry the weight of a crown, and who she desperately, achingly wanted to also be free. That is what the letter was. That is what it remains. Not a royal document, not a historical artifact, a mother's voice still reaching.